since early 2006, each one different. The topic as advertised is Western guilt on your literature, if I can call it that. But there's one thing I would add, which is not on the printed version. You need to add a question mark. Western guilt is with a question mark. We're not assuming we are automatically guilty. That depends on the judge, what he says. Please add a question mark. Now, 4 speakers on the panel, as advertised, are Dr. Arthur Chesterfield-Evans, Mr. Geoff Grimshaw, Mr. Luke TORRIsi, and Professor David FLINT. And they will speak in that order. And questions are going to be the usual format. Questions will be invited from the audience when all 4 speakers have finished, and not before. Please don't interrupt them, or heaven knows what might happen. Don't interrupt them, sit on your hands, take notes. You will be acknowledged. I'm a very fair referee. You will be acknowledged, but you stick your hand up and you come up to the mic, this one, because if you don't do that, you won't be recorded for posterity on our immortal website. They want you to be recorded for posterity. You raise your hands, that's the way to do it. Don't be timid. You weren't timid in getting here. The Roundtable Forums are sponsored by Western Heritage Australia, and that's a long-established discussion and study group aiming to raise public awareness on issues of importance to thinking people, yourselves, or you wouldn't be here. We have no links or affiliations with any other organisation whatsoever, political, religious, commercial, or promotional, or whatever other category you want to put on it. We are totally autonomous, responsible for ourselves. Also, all invited guest speakers and all members of the audience speak for themselves alone. I think that's an Irish political party. They speak for themselves alone, and they do not represent us or our committee. And the selection of previous forum topics, which is quite long, the last three topics we haven't met here since the 14th of November. Now, the reason for that is parliamentary protocol and all sorts of other protocol. We haven't met here since the longest break we've ever had. You thought we were out of business, but we're not. The last one was the death of free speech, which was, the last one was energy poverty on the 14th of November, the death of free speech, and prior to that, Trump, triumph or tragedy. Those 3 were the last 3, last year of course. Apart from that, we've had all sorts of wonderful topics. The first one ever was God in Politics, and then terrorism and the death of democracy, peak oil, cyber hate, family law, Western civilization, is it doomed, the Euro, the Arab Spring, Agenda 21, Australia's future in Asia, truth in history, that's a good one, the death of democracy, United Nations, the cashless society, fake news, where have I heard that before? Okay, we've had a huge variety of topics at these forums since 2006, each one different, usually a panel of 3 or 4 speakers, all of them distinguished people and accomplished people, and they come here to learn. And not only do you come here to learn what other people may say, you come here to learn what you think, because often you don't know until you start talking. Now, our motto is we serve truth and not consensus. Therefore, we're not a political party, never could be one. I saw something in a magazine today, which I must share with you, and it's a beautiful saying, which I never thought of. The future belongs to those who possess the past. And I think this is profoundly true. Now, also, tonight, I want to step out of line a bit, and I will step out of line. I'd like to remind you that guilt, whether we have it or whether we don't have it, is not confined to the West. Today is the 30th anniversary of the massacre in Tiananmen Square, and history will avenge its dead, in my humble opinion. I hope I live long enough to see that history happen. Now, the first speaker in our panel of 4 is Dr. Arthur Chesterfield-Evans, and he's a doctor who became involved in the anti-tobacco campaign and was politicised and joined the Australian Democrats and spent 9 years in the New South Wales Upper House. He worked on more issues and prides himself on thinking for himself. His perspectives are sometimes unusual, and so Dr. Arthur Chesterfield-Evans, you're in the right place. Welcome, Dr. Arthur Chesterfield-Evans.
Thank you very much, David, and I'd like to acknowledge we're meeting on Aboriginal land and pay respect to the elders past and present of the Eora nation. I was delighted to find that it was David who was chairing this. I was introduced, asked if I would come, so they said they'll contact you and have voice contact. And we didn't say who it was. I thought, voice. Sure enough, it was David Duffy. Now there's an iconoclast with a good long track record of thinking unusual thoughts and sticking to. So I'm certainly in the right place in terms of, I think, the people here, and I feel very at home here. I have been on committees here trying to get answers out of ministers, which is very challenging, and quite a few to explain the eastern suburbs tunnel and the oil spill at Greenwich come to mind. Anyway, be that as it may, the topic tonight is Western guilt with a question mark. And when you think about guilt, you think, well, am I personally guilty, or am I guilty because I'm in a certain group? You know, you see the footballers in New South Wales, there's some sex texting going about, and they're all cowering in the collective guilt, presumably, or the collective opprobrium that they might cop. And we're really in the same boat. Being white and Western, we're kind of seen as the problem a lot, or some would see it as such. So I think the question is personal guilt, and the question is that just a state of mind in somebody's head? And if so, do you have a black armband view of history, that you're very guilty and you crawl about because of your wickedness, which is kind of like when I was brought up a Christian in school, in boarding school? Or do you think, well, I feel guilty and I'm morally superior for feeling the guilt, even if I don't think very much about it? So guilt has different responses. And then the question is, if I haven't done anything wrong, am I guilty because the Western tradition of which I'm obviously part, the civilization in which I'm acting is guilty? So I suppose they're the questions I'd ask. The question, I think, is less obvious. Do we need to feel guilt? Has everything just happened deterministically, or did the West have anything to do with it? I suppose that's the third question I'd like to ask. And I suppose if we look at the current problems that we have, I suppose you'd say refugees and terrorism are the ones we're talking about at the moment. Should we feel responsible for refugees in any way? The Aboriginals are still grossly disadvantaged. Is that our fault? And what about injustice in society, the people sitting on the corner with little begging bowls saying, you know, come on mate, what about it? To what extent is that our fault? And I think you would have to say that in the old days there were colonial times, and the whites assumed that they were superior. There was no doubt about that. And they went and shot up the natives and took what they wanted pretty much, or in the more sophisticated times they leaned on the native chiefs and said, look, you can stay as chief if we can just have the resources here, be they whatever they are. And some would argue Australia's still pretty colonial now. We do what the Americans want and give away our resources to foreign companies pretty cheaply, some would say. I'm inclined to think that that's actually true, and I think that the Aboriginals were pushed aside, and we've still not really had a treaty with them. We didn't acknowledge it's their land, and the fact that they're marginalised now, they tell us in the statement from the heart that this is part of the displacement, the feeling of having no place that they feel after our invasion. So I do think that the Western mentality, its colonial past, are responsible for a lot of things. The division of Africa into countries, which was almost random, just simply done as an agreement between the major powers without the slightest consideration of where the existing tribes were, so that as the borders went through the various tribes, of course, the countries that were left were divided and had different bits of half tribes or thirds of tribes in them, which wanted to reunite or join with somebody else. The boundaries were all wrong, and of course that was a good recipe for dividing and ruling. So if that happened more or less accidentally in the countries being drawn in Africa, in Sykes-Picot after the First World War, Sykes and Picot were officials from the British and French government, and they simply drew where the borders would be in the Middle East in order to reward countries that had been good or had won and punish countries that had lost, and how much was of the splitting of the existing races was deliberate and how much of it was you can have this much land and we'll have that much land is not entirely clear. I think academics can argue over that. But Sykes and Picot drew the borders and boundaries in the Middle East to divide the countries there. And the unifying force, of course, has been the Islamic religion, and that's what I think has come back to bite us as these countries were maintained by dictators, and basically if you weren't a dictator, you wouldn't survive because a democracy would break along traditional ethnic lines. So in fact, the Middle East, the tinderbox that became the Middle East, or the potential for explosion in the Middle East was a Western construct after the First World War, which was fiddled with after the Second World War. And then, of course, Israel declared a state of Israel after the Jewish refugees went to Israel. There had not been very many Jews in Israel since the Romans had destroyed them in 350 AD. They flowed in after the Second World War. They reached 36% of the population, and they declared the state of Israel and basically pushed the Palestinians out, at least a large percentage of them out. And the start of the first hijacking by terrorists was of British planes in Egypt in consequence of the creation of the State of Israel, and they supported Britain for that. So the rise of terrorism can be traced to Western meddling, to be blunt. And then, of course, the invasion of Iraq, which of course was once again 60% Shia, 20% Sunni and 20% Kurd, being ruled by the Sunnis, who were at 20% of the population, by a fairly extreme regime in Saddam, which was fine as long as you just wanted to live your own little life, but God help you if you became politically active. And of course he was toppled with some difficulty, and of course the unifying force amongst the people who were adversely affected was the Islamic religion. And terrorism is said to be mindless, but is actually a political tactic of the weak against the powerful. So I think we have to bear that in mind, that if we say terrorism is mindless, it's not. It's actually quite well thought out. People sometimes die wantonly and stupidly when they're drunk crossing the road, but if they're actually setting out to plan something against a country and bring attention to their cause or their plight, they are not mindless. It is quite well thought out, and there are reasons for it. If you want to find them, you can find them. It's quite simple. If you want to know why Osama bin Laden blew up the buildings in America, you can just go on the web and he'll tell you. And of course he was educated in America and speaks very good English, so that if you say, well, this is mindless terror, no, he did it because of the American bombardment of Lebanon, in fact, in support of the Israelis. It was quite clear why he did it. He said, these are normal people getting bombarded for no good reason, so I'll give you a taste of your own medicine. That's the potted version. I'm not saying terrorism is right, I'm just saying if you're looking for reasons for things, they're not as hard to find as they might be. You just have to look for them. Now, so I've talked about refugees, so to some extent I've talked about terrorism, I've sort of alluded to Aboriginal things. Now, to Aboriginal injustice as part of colonialism. So I'm saying there's quite a lot to feel guilty about, and it is due to Western civilization. It is true that a personal at an interpersonal level, we can't necessarily do anything about it. But I think there's one other big thing I'd say. The first two world wars, or both the world wars, were caused by fighting of emerging powers looking for markets. The Germans and the Japanese were expanding, modernising economy, who wanted some markets in order to make money selling the products that they were producing, and they weren't given those markets, so they attacked basically. So after the Second World War, they decided that we don't want any more wars, we'll let countries, we'll let the currencies float, we'll let anyone sell to anybody, we'll break down trade barriers, and the countries that do well will get rich, and the countries that get poor will get poor, and there won't be any wars, it'll all be, the big powers will sort themselves out. And sure enough, that happened. But if you've ever played Monopoly, if the money simply flows wherever it goes, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And the people who take the ideological position that we shouldn't interfere in the market are basically the referees in a Monopoly game, watching the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And the colonial heritage, if you want to put it that way, the colonial behaviours, I think led to, and then the freedom of markets to stop people, governments stopping markets flowing, effectively meant that money flowed to the people who had the money and could run the mines, run the trade, own the oil, and so on. They could set the prices, and the other people took the prices, and basically the people who set the prices get the money in the long term. So effectively the impoverishment of some countries was kind of built in to the war prevention strategy that came out of the settlement of the Second World War. And so when you say, why are the refugees trying to get from Africa to Europe, or why are the refugees trying to get from the Middle East to anywhere else, there are long reasons for that. I don't think anything was done maliciously particularly, but it is cause and effect. So we're left in the situation that, given this situation, our choice is, well, whether we feel guilty or not in our heads, and we can either wear black armbands, or we can feel superior because we feel guilty about things without doing anything, or we can actually start to work on the problems and start to try and make the situation better at a personal level. Now, how we as individuals fix all those problems is obviously very difficult. I mean, we can just buy a better boat and a better kitchen and forget about it all, or we can get a bit more politically active and try and act towards some sort of social justice, and I think that's very important. And of course we can do a little bit of personal charity when we go past the guy in the corner to say, oh, he might be a millionaire just pretending. Well, he might, but if you looked at the probabilities, he probably isn't. So we should look at the realities that surround us, and I think act with a sensible and compassionate humanity would be my answer to what we should do about Western guilt. How long have I got?
A couple of minutes?
Well, I don't need it, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arthur Chesterfield-Evans. Now, our second speaker in tonight's panel is Geoff Grimshaw, and I'll say initially that the spelling of his name in the programme is not correct. It's J-E-F-F. Please accept our apologies for that. It was inadvertent. Geoff Grimshaw is the son of a history teacher and doctor, and later a graduate of history, politics and international relations from Nottingham University. He was born and raised in Blackburn, one of the great industrial towns of England. He was thus steeped in the history of the Industrial Revolution, going on regular school trips to the factory-turned-museums of Lancashire, the residence of the great inventors, and seeing firsthand the magnificent and noisy machines that boiled, pumped, spun and rotated. His last school trip was to the Soviet Union less than a year before it collapsed, though he claims he had nothing to do with that. Thank you, Geoff, thank you. At university, he specialised in 20th century history, wartime propaganda, and the rise and fall of socialism. Since then, he has never ceased reading and studying history, politics, economics, and ran as a candidate for the Australian Conservatives at the recent New South Wales state election. He also has a master's degree in information technology and specialised and then worked in advanced artificial intelligence and found himself working on computer models that utilised historical data and models to predict and optimise current and future business decisions. He believes the greatest lesson of history is that those who forget the past will be condemned to repeat it. How true. Welcome, Geoff Grimshaw, please.
Thank you, David. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners and builders who constructed this magnificent room and building, complete with clean water, plumbing, lighting, magnificent stained glass windows, carpets, and many fine written works of law and literature. Apparently, we are supposed to feel guilty for all of this, which is the topic of tonight's talk. So thank you to Western Heritage for inviting me to speak on this topic, something I believe has weighed on our shoulders for far too long. And thank you to Arthur and in advance to the other speakers tonight. Tonight I will cover several topics. Firstly, the importance of context. Then the what, why and how of Western guilt. And finally, I will suggest that there is actually something the West should apologise for and how this would actually resolve the concept of Western guilt. To kick off, let's do a survey. I did a little bit of research on a period of history and concluded the following. Sorry, I was correct. Sorry, whose computer is this?
It belongs to this place. Government.
It's the government.
That's why it doesn't work.
Okay, look, I'll just go. I'll go from my slides then. I'll just go from this. Okay, so I think that's not going to work. I have to do it. Okay, so I came to this conclusion. The Anglosphere, that's Britain, Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada, were responsible for the deaths of around 5 million people. Now, I don't want to go over the top here, so I'll set a baseline of an apology, undertakings not to do it again, a few memorials to those killed and their culture or ideology or religion or race, and let's say 500 million in compensation. So that's the sort of baseline. If anybody thinks that, if you agree with that or think it should be something more, just put your hand up. No, not even an apology. Okay, let's just do
No
an apology.
apologies, No.
An apology?
No.
Shit happens.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
you said
Apology. I think we can go for an apology.
Socialism.
Okay. How about now?
Thank you.
So, do you still want to apologise, pay compensation to the Japanese and the Nazis? Anybody? No? Okay, good. So, you see, when you give something context like that, it can change what you think dramatically. So you think, oh wow, we killed 5 million people. During the Second World War, the Japanese Imperial Army and the Nazis, well, it gives it some context then, doesn't it? Because context is absolutely critical to history. Now here's a great example of context. This is General Nguyen Loan. Everybody knows this picture, I hope. Very, very famous picture from the Vietnam War. But how many of you know the backstory? Who knows the backstory of what happened here? Okay, there's going to be one or two, good. So, most people saw this picture and video and thought, well, here's a South Vietnamese general executing a poor, innocent civilian or soldier in the street. What they didn't tell you, or what they kept quiet and what nobody knows about, is that the person on the right, the person being shot, whose name was Bay Lap, the day before, he was actually a VC undercover assassin. He'd been killing South Vietnamese policemen, and he had gone to a policeman's home, and he had captured the wife and his 6 children, tied up the policeman. He then slit the throats of the 6 children in front of the father and the mother, and then killed the mother, and then killed the father. He was found earlier that day by the South Vietnamese police at a mass grave of policemen trying to bury them and hide them. He was brought along to General Nguyen. General Nguyen was the best friend of this policeman. He was also godfather to the 6 children. So that when they brought this thing to him, Nguyen said to his soldiers, execute him, and none of them wanted to, so he took out his pistol and waved them away and shot him through the head. Lowen wasn't tried because he committed no crime. The execution was actually completely legal within the terms of the Geneva Convention. He was later injured, and even Australia refused to treat him because they knew who he was and what he'd done. He moved to the US with great difficulty and started a business, a pizza place, until it was discovered who he was, and he was forced to shut down his business. We think doxing, harassing and boycotting is something new. No, the left have been doing this for decades. And this was all because he shot a brutal and sadistic murderer and child killer. And who knows what this murderer and child killer might have become. He might have turned into the Vietnamese version of Pol Pot. In any case, anyone aerating the head of a socialist deserves a medal in my book. I'll just say that out loud.
I agree.
So that picture was actually used very successfully as propaganda. There were others, of course, most notably the Napalm Girl. But the power of that shot was phenomenal. Both the shot and the shot. An apparent innocent civilian executed in cold blood in the streets by a South Vietnamese officer, but almost nobody knew the truth, because as the saying goes, the first casualty of war is truth. Wartime propaganda is a subject unto itself. When two sides are fighting for the dominance of an ideology, the need to bolster the morale of your own side whilst denigrating the other is apparent. Wars involving territorial resources produce comparatively little propaganda compared to wars of ideology. It is telling that we refer to the current disagreements over black armband history as the culture wars. Context is also time critical, i.e. you judge people by the standards of their time, not ours. So what are we in the West supposed to be guilty of? Well, that's easily answered. You just have to listen to the average left-wing activist, street protester, or the ABC. Slavery, colonialism, genocide, of course, scream the SJWs. The argument goes that the West is only successful because of slavery and colonialism. Okay, so let's break that claim down, shall we? The contemporary West undoubtedly originated with the Industrial Revolution. The inventions, innovations and discoveries made during this real great leap forward are the backbone of everything we see around us today. The flying shuttle, the spinning jenny, the Newcomen Watt steam engine, the cotton gin, the telegraph, tarmac, flush toilet sewers, the Bessemer process, the voltage battery, the electric motor, power looms, gas lamps, incandescent bulbs, tin cans, the camera, the safety match, typewriter, the dynamo, AC/DC electricity, trains. Okay, I could go on forever. I'm starting to sound like that Monty Python, what have the Romans ever done for us, scene in the life of Brian. Anyhow, not one single one of this seemingly endless list of inventions and innovations that sprouted out of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment had anything to do with colonialism or slavery. The blueprints for the telephone were not stolen from Burkina Faso. The internal combustion engine was not invented in India and then pilfered by the East India Company. Marconi did not invade Mozambique and chain their inhabitants together and demand they build a working prototype of the wireless telegraph. Then there are the intangible innovations and discoveries, the rule of law, the education system, constitutions, parliamentary democracy, the scientific method. Again, Newton didn't come up with the laws of gravitation by throwing slaves from bell towers at Cambridge University. Aside from the fact there were no slaves in England, he couldn't have done that. The furthest south that Adam Smith ever got was Geneva, and John Locke didn't purloin the ideas of natural rights from Papua New Guinea. There is not a single invention, innovation, idea or discovery that was made, taken from, or involved in any way, shape or form, or any single person or group from a colony or from a slave or from any subject of any colonial power. None. Zilch. Zippo. The next time you hear someone claim that the West is wealthy because it stole its wealth from colonial countries or because of slavery, then ask them who and where the steam train was stolen from, or how many slaves built the factories of the industrial northern English towns. The Industrial Revolution would have happened with or without colonialism or slavery. But what if it had never happened at all? What if the West were as impoverished now as it were in the pre-Industrial Revolution days? Do you think there would be any of these demands for reparations? I doubt it. But let's indulge this idea that colonialism and slavery must be compensated for. How would this work exactly? Surely all nations or religions or tribal groups that practice slavery or colonialism should have to pay up. Why only the West? And since every single nation, race, religion, tribe has practiced both slavery and colonialism at some time or other, it's going to be a massive undertaking to figure out who owes who what and what the compensation is going to be, and so on. I mean, who exactly is going to go to Mongolia and demand that they pay up for Genghis Khan? How would it work on an individual basis? Will Barack Obama, well, his father was Kenyan and he was never a transatlantic slave, and his mother was white, so he would have to pay half compensation and receive absolutely none. Maybe, in fact, his Kenyan father was descended from someone who captured and sold slaves in Africa. Does he have to pay more then? How about the black owners of slaves in the US? Will indentured servitude count as slavery? Will Ireland compensate England for St. Patrick, the Englishman who was kidnapped by Celtic raiding tribes in the 5th century and taken back to Ireland as a slave? I mean, St. Patrick wasn't just anybody, he was a celebrity slave. So how about all profits from St. Patrick's Day celebrations globally are given to England? Will the Islamic world compensate Europe for the people they enslaved in Andalusia, or those seized after invasions, or those kidnapped through piracy? The Islamic slave trade vastly outnumbered the Western slave trade and was far more brutal. If the tri-hybrid theory of Australian settlement is proven beyond a reasonable doubt by anthropologists, then how will contemporary Aborigines, who would actually then be the third nation and not the first nation, compensate the Moravians and the Negritos, especially since both distinct groups were wiped out in the only actual genocide seen on this continent. And since it is estimated that nearly every single person alive today is descended from someone who was a slave,